Leader, I must first reiterate the calls for justice for Isaiah Henry, Joel Henry, and Harris Singh. These calls are being made by thousands of Guyanese across the length and breadth of this country and also in the diaspora. Mr. Speaker, last week I chose to go and meet with the mourning citizens that took to the streets demanding justice. I chose to be with them, cognizant of the fact that this seat that I occupy in this honorable house is not my own, but it belongs and represents thousands of Guyanese. And Mr. Speaker, when those Guyanese call out for justice, it is my duty to be there, to stand with them, to fight for them, and to work towards implementing change that will benefit them. Mr. Speaker, it is in this regard that I stand here today to demand inclusion and to defend the working class of Guyana, a group that was completely neglected in this 2020 budget, a budget that was touted as the people's budget, but lacks the basic components to satisfy the needs of the working class in a time of emergency given the COVID-19 pandemic. Mr. Speaker, I have heard 9 presentations from the opposite side of this House thus far, and there wasn't a single presentation that highlighted any substantive aspect of the 2020 budget that will benefit the poor people of Guyana. Instead, Mr. Speaker, utterances of the people's budget are echoed in this House, but those utterances are void of substance, empty words that means absolutely nothing to the analytical mind. Mr. Speaker, the honorable members on the opposite side of this House is selling a dream to the Guyanese people, a dream that seeks to convince us that giving tax breaks to corporations will result in prosperity for the working class family. But this dream will not be sold, as such a concept is riddled in fraud. Mr. Speaker, some of the most famous quotes about trickle-down economics, a concept that this budget is based on, comes from the minds of people like Warren Buffett, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, and economists too numerous to mention here today, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the politician Bernie Sanders once said, trickle-down economics is a fraud. Giving tax breaks to the rich and large corporations does not create jobs. It simply makes the rich richer, enlarges the budget deficit, and increases income and wealth inequality. We need economic policies that benefit working families and not the billionaire class, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we can look at this from the billionaire class, and I will quote from Warren Buffett. He said, and I quote, "The rich always is going to say, just give us the money and we'll go out and we'll spend more and then it will all trickle down to the rest of you." Mr. Buffett further said, "But that has not worked in the last decade." End of quote. Mr. Speaker, trickle-down economics, or the more technical term, supply-side economics, is not only a failed 20th century concept that first-year economists and economic students would have learned in their classes when they read of how not to manage an economy. It is also, as sad as the fact is, the only way to describe the sad excuse for economic policy which the PPP intends to force upon the working families of Guyana, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to give you some numbers now. The 2012 census reported that there was a total of 210,124 households This budget caters to borrowing $75 billion to accomplish poorly structured goals set out in it. To further break that down, each household will now be burdened with a national debt increase of $357,000 in a single quarter-year period to further enrich the wealthy. Imagine what $357,000 would have meant to the parents struggling to send their children to school. Imagine what $357,000 would have meant to the cleaners barely managing to pay their basic bills. Imagine what $357,000 could do for the families who are struggling with the impact of COVID-19. But instead, Mr. Speaker, in an emergency budget that is presented in the midst of a pandemic, the governing administration is dangling a carrot of $25,000 per household, while simultaneously adding a national debt burden of $357,000 to each household. Never before has there been a more direct attack on the working people of Guyana. This is not just incompetence, Mr. Speaker. This is betrayal. With this fact before our collective faces, the Guyanese people now has their intelligence insulted by this cabal, with claims that the oil money would not be used to cover the outrageous new borrowing, the ridiculousness of the opposite side's claim that they will not use the $60 billion in total oil revenues expected in 2020 to cover parts of the $75 billion they will be borrowing in this budget is a proverbial spit in the faces of the Guyanese people. Guyanese families who had hoped that monies from national oil went, money that rightfully belongs to them, monies that they had hoped that they could have used to uplift their standard of living. These families must now watch as the hopes and dreams of a generation are trampled by the greed of the PPP and their business friends. Mr. Speaker, the PPP further makes the delusional claim that taxable items and businesses would result in the price of items and ease the burden on the poor. Cutting these taxes will do no such thing. We are left to wonder if this is the result of a gross misunderstanding of basic economic principles or a show of total ignorance of economic science. It appears that we need to seek the help of some secondary school economic students to explain the upward stickiness of price to the learned members of the opposite side of the House. Mr. Speaker, this budget was crafted in deceit and betrayal. As I speak of deceit, Mr. Speaker, I implore that we turn our attention to the Ministry of Culture, Youth and Sports. Mr. Speaker, just a few days back, the 2020 estimates were presented in this House. That budget presentation alluded to the amount of money that will be spent on culture, youth, and sports. I turn your attention to the budget speech pages. We have page 51, paragraph 3, line 2, when I read. To this end, $2.7 billion has been allocated for culture, youth, and sports, for which $805.3 million is for sports. Mr. Speaker, I just quoted from the budget speech. $2.7 billion is said to have been allocated to culture, youth, and sports. Yet, Mr. Speaker, if you turn your attention to the actual estimates, you would realize that a mere $1.2 billion was allocated to the Ministry of Culture, Youth, and Sports, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, with allocations of $2.7 billion towards culture, youth, and sports, the Ministry of Culture, Youth, and Sports will only receive $1.2 billion. Less than half of the budgetary allocations, Mr. Speaker. This is nothing less than a vote of no confidence in the Minister of Culture, Youth, and Sports from his own colleagues in his ability to effectively and efficiently manage any significant project under his portfolio. Within the budget speech document, again, Mr. Speaker, this time I turn your attention to page 49, paragraph 3, line 5 through 8. And I quote, additionally, His Excellency President Irfan Ali has already announced that a Youth Advisory Council will be established, reflecting our country's diversity, for which $25 million has been allocated to support its effective functioning. We see here, Mr. Speaker, even the Youth Advisory Council is not being entrusted in the hands of the appointed Minister of Culture, Youth, and Sport. This is the level of deceit and betrayal that is reflected in this budget, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it is utterly disheartening that in a budget of $330 billion, only 0.3% was allocated to the Ministry of Culture, Youth, and Sport. When young people collectively account for over 60% of the population in Guyana, this is a clear sign of disrespect to the youth. Mr. Speaker, there are businesses on region streets that will be getting tax cuts from this very budget that is greater than the total allocation to the Ministry of Culture, Youth, and Sport. Let that sink in. The governing administration has shown that 0.3% of their focus and priority is on our country's culture. 0.3% of their focus is on our athletes. And yes, the same 0.3% of their priority is on our future. How can we say that we are building a nation when those who stand to benefit are not strongly considered? It is our youth, our future. If they are not reaping the benefits, then I beg the question, who then are the real beneficiaries of this budget? Let me remind the Honorable House of some of the accomplishments as it regards youth under the APNU+AFC administration. We have the 5B program, 700 graduates from GTI with technical skills, hundreds of scholarship issues, 186 million hinterland student dormitory constructed, STEM programs winning international prize in Dubai, ICT hubs constructed everywhere, smart classrooms to facilitate e-learning, leadership, financial and literacy training, National Youth Corps, public sector college, best ever CSEC results in the Caribbean. And the list goes on, Mr. Speaker. This is proof of youth-centeredness when it comes to governance. Mr. Speaker, the PPP wants to tell Guyanese that they are government for all. But I know differently. For I know firsthand what it is like to live in a community that was completely neglected under the PPP. Mr. Speaker, I was born and raised in Bartica, Region 7, a small community that has unwavering support for the APNU+AFC coalition. Because of that fact, Mr. Speaker, under the 23 years of the PPP rule, Bartica was neglected. Hundreds of people died for lack of basic health care in Bartica. Today, thanks to the APNU+AFC coalition government, Bartica Hospital is now a regional hospital that saves hundreds of lives. Mr. Speaker, The transformation that took place in Bartica over the last 5 years is simply unprecedented. The transport and harbor selling is no longer an eyesore like it was under the PPP administration. GPL is no longer an old, not working, blackout-oriented facility. Today, there are brand new power plants in Bartica with undisturbed power. That's
Honorable member,
what.
for you to tell us more and conclude, you will need an extension.
I so move, Comrade Speaker, that the honorable member be given 5 minutes to conclude our presentation.
Thank you, honorable member. Honorable member, you may continue to conclude.
I will reiterate my last point as I continue, Mr. Speaker. As I was saying, GPL is no longer an old, not working, blackout-oriented facility. Today, there is a brand new power plant with undisturbed power in Bartica. That was the standard set by the APNU+AFC administration, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the budget was presented under the theme, Our Plan for Prosperity. That alone, Mr. Speaker, is a very frightening concept. If the PPP's plans for prosperity is to increase the overall deficit as a percentage of GDP to 8%, then there is no prosperity to look forward to. If the plan for prosperity is the meager 2-week bonus for the joint services, then there is no plan for prosperity. If their plan for prosperity is a one-off payment of $25,000 per household, with no focus on equity versus equality rather, then there is absolutely no plan of prosperity for you to look forward to. Mr. Speaker, I grew up in a simple family, the kind of family that so many Guyanese can relate to, the type of family that needs the most but often receives the least. I am sure that there are members on the opposite side of this house that have similar stories to tell. Stories of struggles whilst growing up. Yet we see them standing firm and vigorously defending this budget, a budget that has absolutely no real benefit to poor people. To those members, I say, you are not a part of the problem. You are the problem. This is not the best you could have done when it does nothing good for the ordinary people of Guyana, but rather add to their already overloaded daily burdens. To me, tell me, where is the cards drip for the people of Guyana? This budget is not put together for the ordinary people. It was not done with their best interests at heart. This budget lacks compassion for our people. It reeks of crude capitalism, a system in which the wealthy gets wealthier